Hello! Welcome to another episode of No Franchise Fatigue presents The Good, the Bad, the Weird, the Wild, our monthly podcast where we pick out one cinematic figure and then dissect their filmography to choose films for each of the titular categories: good, bad, weird, and, yep, you guessed it, wild. My name is Matt Reifschneider, and I am joined by host 2, host harder, Sean Caylor. How are you doing this evening, Sean?
I'm doing really, really good. I just practiced some naked kung fu in front of a mirror, and I'm ready to take over LAX.
Yeah, this is why I really regret that we do these video chats, because I don't want to see any of that. I don't want to see you hosting that hard. I really don't. Not anymore.
It's
We're done with this.
hey, you're host hard, I'm host harder. It's
It's,
gotta be.
it's good. It's just how it is. It's just how it is. So tonight we're going to be talking about a very peculiar filmography by a very weirdly interesting director who goes by the name Renny Harlin.
Born in 1959 as Renny. Oh, that's a Finnish name.
You better not edit that out.
But he directed commercials and mostly started in the Finnish film market, although did not have a lot of success there. He did make a movie called Prison, which did lead him to getting Nightmare on Elm Street 4, which is where he started kind of building up his name, and a few successful movies after that, including obviously Die Hard 2, Die Harder, has led us to the filmmaker we all know and acknowledge.
So
So,
this is a director I remember, like I distinctly remember his name because of films like Die Hard 2 and films like Cliffhanger and a lot of those kind of, 90s action flicks that were actually pretty big box office successes. And so like he was a name that I certainly recognized. And obviously as time has gone on, his career has kind of, for lack of a better term, walked the plank, especially after Cutthroat Island. So he has had a really interesting career. So it's one of the reasons I pitched him to you for Good, Bad, Weird, Wild, is that he has a relatively interesting career. Going back through and watching, I've watched probably a dozen of his films over the last couple weeks preparing for this podcast. I never realized that for a director as prolific as he was and still is, that he's very much not an auteur like most of the directors we've talked about so far on this series. And I think that's, in its own way, utterly fascinating.
that is true. He's very, very much a journeyman director. He's like a Ron Howard, where he'll get your movie done, but it's not like he has a huge personal stamp on anything. Like you throw the dude a script, he'll make it.
Right.
He doesn't have players. He doesn't have the Hitchcock pull. He doesn't have Quentin Tarantino's weird foot fetish.
Right. Those marks that make a director an auteur. He doesn't have those. And it was something that I always assumed he did. And as I was rewatching these, I realized he doesn't. He is kind of a, like you said, journeyman, a blue collar director who is a hired gun by all means, and really just kind of does the job he's asked to do. Now, whether or not that's considered a good thing or bad thing, I suppose depends on how you view cinema in a lot of ways, because he's giving a lot of these movies to either the writers or whatever that might be, instead of putting his own stamp on it. And it made for, when rewatching this filmography, to pick out my four choices, wildly eclectic. Like it was kind of hard to make my four choices because it kind of depended on the movie and where I wanted to come from versus the director itself, which I think is really unique because I don't think we've covered a director quite like Renny Harlin before.
No, we've certainly stuck to people with at least style.
Yeah, ones that have a particular, even a particular stamp in terms of the kinds of movies they make or whatever that might be. Because Renny Harlin's all over the place. As you mentioned, he kind of got his career start in horror, then he gets, thrown into the action foray, and then goes back to horror, back to action, does a couple of dramas in there, and throws a lot of interesting stuff into the sky. And we'll get to it because one of my choices very much goes to this. He's had a weird resurgence of his career in the last 4 or 5 years in a completely different market. That's not Hollywood, which is really kind of an interesting turn for somebody's filmography. So, but I think that kind of leads us into um, why don't we just start picking off our choices so that we can talk a little bit more in detail about things. And just for people to know out there that we do go into spoilers for all of these films. So if you have not seen the films that we start to mention, we will be talking about plot points and plot progressions in these films that may come off as spoilerish. So if that's something that, offends you or anything like that, please feel free to just pause this podcast right now. Go watch a few of his films, or as I always like to say, it's not necessarily about the spoilers as much as how you get there. So that's always kind of been my point of view on that. But nonetheless, I threw out that warning. That warning is now out into the stratosphere. People can take it or leave it. And hit me, Sean. Hit me. What is your choice for the good?
So this is gonna seem like a little out of left field because this is actually a very late stage movie for him. But as a fan generally of found footage horror, I was a really, really big fan of Devil's Pass. I really think that this is kind of a deeply underrated movie. It gets a bad rap because people just don't like the found footage style. But everything we just talked about with Renny Harlin kind of makes him a perfect director for this because it's a chameleon. This is one of the few found footage movies since the original Blair Witch that honestly feels like a couple of students got lost in the Russian mountains. And it's already a fascinating story. If you've never heard of the. I have a Russian girlfriend too, so me mispronouncing this is going to be tragic. Dietlov Pass incident. But if you've never heard of that, it's already an inherently fascinating story, including people that froze to death and as they're freezing, strip naked and run into the middle of the frozen wilds. And this movie also brings in like government conspiracies and yetis, and it's a whole thing. This movie's really quite the adventure, but it's also extremely low key. It kind of came out with no impact, no fanfare. I mean, I just randomly stumbled across it on a streaming service one day. I didn't even realize it was a Renny Harlin film until the credits. But it was, boy, what a pleasant surprise. I really liked it. So, out of curiosity, what do you think?
That's an interesting choice for the good. Um, I think you're absolutely correct that it kind of came and went without a lot of fanfare, mostly because it's found footage, but also like Devil's Pass is a terrible title. Its original
Yeah.
title is the Dyatlov Pass Incident, which is a much better title that's more fitting for the film too, because the film is done in a mockumentary style. This is actually one of the films I rewatched because the first time I watched it, I remember being pleasantly surprised by it. And when I rewatched it last week, I was even more impressed with it. He handles the film really well because it really builds a lot of mystery. There's a lot of, like, as you mentioned, there's a lot of comparisons to Blair Witch Project that can be made to this film. And I think rightfully so because it's fascinating how he builds the character development in it. And this is kind of one of those times where you realize that Renny Harlin actually has quite a bit of tools in his belt to be able to tackle a film like this, which is completely different than anything he's ever done prior to it. And considering it's like, I believe it's a Russian British co production, it's not even a Hollywood
That's
film, it's made outside of the system, which means it's a
yeah.
fully independent film. Well, and IFC is the one that released it, so it is an indie film. But
Russian.
it's interesting that he would jump in, particularly because um, I know he did a movie between this and 12 Rounds, But 12 Rounds he had done just before this, which was was one of the films to really kick off the WWE studios, and he seems like a perfect fit for that film in terms of the normal movies he usually makes. But it was interesting that he would follow up 12 Rounds with something like Devil's Pass in terms of his filmography, because it's truly kind of an interesting film, and I actually highly respect that you threw this on for the good.
All right. What, my friend, do you think is Renny Harlin's good?
So for my choice of the good, I actually think is a much safer choice than yours. I do appreciate that that was the choice that you made for yours, but I have to throw that my personal favorite of his. I'm not sure you could argue it's his best film, but definitely my favorite of his is Cliffhanger.
Very
And
nice.
I think what makes Cliffhanger really interesting is that this was a period in Sylvester Stallone's career where he was trying to go back to action films. He had stepped away to do a little bit more comedy and tried to diversify his acting profile. And it really wasn't, audiences weren't buying into it. And so in the early 90s, he decided to kind of kick back into the action foray. He does a film like Cliffhanger, and this is the follow up to Die Hard 2 for Renny Harlin. So Renny Harlin gets Die Hard 2, which really puts his name on the map as the director to be, and it's I think it's very obvious why Sylvester Stallone chose him for Cliffhanger. And then not only they must have gotten along because they would team up again later on for the film Driven, which admittedly is a film I've actually never seen. So, but it's interesting that they would end up working together, almost 10 years later, once again on a completely different film. But I adore Cliffhanger. I think Cliffhanger is the perfect balance between stupid and entertaining. I mean, there's the script for it is thin at best, and it relies so heavily on its cast, which is stacked. The aforementioned Sly, John Lithgow as the villain of the film, as a terrorist, along with Michael Rooker. Michael Rooker, I love Michael Rooker. I'll watch anything with him in it. It's a stacked cast, and it's got some great action set pieces to it, and some wild shit in this movie. You'll Sylvester Stallone literally stabs a guy on a stalactite made of ice. Like one hanging from the ceiling, not from the floor. He picks up a guy and then stabs him on the ceiling. And I'm sorry, a scene like that automatically puts this in the good for me.
Yeah, Rooker is one of those guys. I mean, ever since Portrait of a Serial Killer, you could tell he was just gonna be like the quintessential movie villain, and has always proven to be so. He's always very entertaining and everything. I love this movie. Like, honestly, made a very, very good argument for my good as well. It's a nostalgic movie. This is one of those, how every once in a while you just have like a really strong childhood memory. I just for whatever reason, distinctly remember seeing this movie in theaters with my dad. And yeah, for whatever reason, like you say, it's a big, silly, stupid action movie. I mean, it is just capital A 90s action, but it's certainly a fun movie. And
Yep.
like you say,
Yep.
Lithgow, oh man, MVP. Oh, and one other note, you're bashing Stallone's comedy career, but I do love that Oscar.
Good God. I was just talking with someone at work the other day who was like, man, I really love the movie Oscar. And I like had to do everything I could in my soul to not die right there. Just like keel over on the goddamn table. I think I admittedly
Not
I
even
haven't
a
seen that movie since the 90s, so I should revisit, but
it's like I'm not even a little bit kidding. Tying back into Renny Harlin, my mom's favorite movies are Long Kiss Goodnight and Oscar. It's not even those are it.
I'm shocked that you didn't pick The Long Kiss Goodnight for good. So I'm really curious to see if this pops up later on your list. So, but why don't we just chug right along? Why don't we
Uh,
just
this is a list, and yes, I'm happy to chug right along into the bad. This is a race to the bottom, as I've said. But this is choosing by their talent as a director. And as much as I love The Long Kiss Goodnight in its acting and its writing, which is where it did come up before, there's just nothing special to it as far as that goes.
Yeah, that's true. I'll give you that. I'll give you that. That it is mostly the script for that movie that kind of carries it, and the two main stars. But and Renny Harlin, as we kind of mentioned, Renny Harlin just kind of carries movies like that. Like he does nothing to deter, Gina Davis or Samuel L. Jackson or Shane Black for that film. He does nothing to derail it, but he certainly doesn't necessarily lift it up any higher than I think it might have been. So. Good call. Good call. All right. So why don't you just move right in? Move on. Hit me with your bad. Hit me with your bad shot. Fire away.
I think this may be the first time anyone has ever talked about this on a movie podcast ever, because this is a film that came out and then nobody ever talked about it again. 2006's The Covenant, which, by the way, for the longest time, I thought was a Len Wiseman movie. After seeing it in Renny Harlin's IMDb, I was like, what? Um,
Even better is you picked it for the bad because you didn't even know it was a Renny Harlin movie.
no, yeah, I saw it on the IMDb, and I did revisit it. So I mean, this is a fair. Boy, this movie's just lazy and dull. And the reason it feels like a Len Wiseman movie is this is Underworld, but with witches instead. And not even nearly that interesting. And let me promise, if we ever get to Underworld, you're finally going to hear me just unload nonstop the whole episode. Because you have heard me say before, I'm not a big fan of vampires. And I'm not a big fan of werewolves. So what do you think I think of Underworld?
Well, are you a fan of goth?
Yes, but that's not in Underworld's favor.
Okay, fair point. Fair point. We will save that for an underworld discussion later on. I have to admit, I've never actually seen Covenant, and I was just as shocked as you to see that that was a Renny Harlin movie, which is why I had to point out why that's funny because I was like, he did direct Covenant. That was a movie that when it came out, I was totally disinterested in seeing. It has never crossed my list, and even when I was revisiting a bunch of Renny Harlin's movies in the last 2 weeks, I was like, man, I don't own it. I should go see how much it is to rent just to see if just to watch it for the first time. And I looked at it and I was like, man, $3.99. Ugh, I'm not sure I want to spend that much money. And so it just glazed on by once again. But it just I remember like the trailers and stuff for it, and it did disinterest me. I mean, I enjoy the Underworld series. We can certainly battle over that when we get there, but it's obvious that it's a knockoff. Like, I mean, it was obvious back then. It's obvious to this day that that's what it is. And again, Renny Harlin as a director, man, he may not put a distinctive stamp on anything, but he'll deliver what you ask. If a studio asks for an Underworld knockoff, that's what he's going to deliver. Win, lose, or draw, that's what you're going to get. So, in a weird way, I have to tip his hat that he pulled off a knockoff. So,
But, yeah, much like Too Fast, Too Furious, it's effects that weren't even good in their time. It's just the story is really dull. It's a lot of family political intrigue. It just immediately expects you to care about like these five families or the scions of these five families who are coming into their power and eh, ugh, it's really literally only notable for being I think it might be Sebastian Stan's first movie. And it might be Taylor Kitsch's first like theatrical movie.
oh wow, I didn't know that. That kind of makes me not
Uh,
want to see it more.
uh,
I'm just gonna argue that point, but okay, cool.
let me also say that's literally like I think those are the biggest names in the cast. They didn't even like stunt cast an old character actor or anything.
Right, like
Nothing.
it.
Billy Zane or something. Yeah.
Right, like even Underworld did that with Bill Nighy. They're like Bill Nighy is kind of like this A-list kind of traditional actor that they threw into those films. But oh, that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I totally get you. Bad because number one, it's never ever asked me to see it. I've never felt inclined to see it. And then when I saw it would cost me $3, I was like, that's just too much. That's a hurdle I'm not willing to jump. So not even for this podcast. So
So, my
fair enough.
friend, spoiled choice. What would you say is his worst movie?
I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna cheat on you right now with this category. I mean, this is the first time I'm ever gonna really cheat. It's probably not the last time that I cheat for this podcast, but I'm not going to say the title of a movie, but a kind of movie for the bad. And I'm going to say that his bad is the historically set action film.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, at least one of the movies.
The truth is, yes, you're right. This is low-hanging fruit. But to continue your pun, no wonder it's so juicy, because it's low-hanging fruit that literally sank a studio.
Absolutely. How do you I knew that I was curious to see if I have two films that I was debating between for this, both of them historically set action films that I do not think are good at all. And I thought for sure you would choose Cutthroat Island as yours. So originally I was going to say Cutthroat Island would be it if not. But then I just came to the decision that maybe I should talk about both of these films because you're absolutely right. Cutthroat Island was the giant, big budget bomb that essentially sank a studio. Pretty much killed his career. He got one more shot after this, which was Long Kiss Goodnight, which then sank his career.
I was
So
about to say, which he took Gina Davis with him on that one, because this pretty much ended Gina Davis's career too.
yeah, and they were married at the time, were they not? I'm pretty sure they were. So,
The big rumors. That's why she was cast in it.
yep,
Miscast, most would say.
horrifically miscast. Now, so Cutthroat Island is a movie I had not seen in 20 years, probably by the time I rewatched it last week. And rewatching it last week, it dawned on me that Cutthroat Island is the movie that had to walk, trip on its own stupidity, drown in its own vomit for Disney to realize, oh, there's actually something interesting here, and then fix it all for the Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Somebody saw Last of the Mohicans and thought, anyone can do that.
Anybody can do that. So there's certain things in Cutthroat Island that are interesting, particularly the amount of explosions in this movie, like and how large the explosions are. It's stunningly stupid, like how big these explosions are. Entertaining, I will give it, but stunningly stupid. But it's interesting that how much this movie actually has in common with the Pirates of the Caribbean films. If you just took out the supernatural element, including like the idea that Matthew Modine plays kind of a thieving pirate, who's scoundrel slash suave guy, very similar to Jack Sparrow, just without the quirkiness of Johnny Depp in that performance. So it's a poor man's Jack Sparrow, but one that came well before Jack Sparrow. So it's really interesting watching that movie from this lens now that there's been 5 Pirates of the Caribbean movies and a new one on the way, that looking back at Cutthroat Island just to see that that movie really did lay all of the framework for this boat to float, and how Disney just literally watched it and went, oh, this was what's wrong with it. This was what's wrong with it. Let's fix all of that and keep all the fun stuff. And that's how we'll make this franchise, straight up. The other film I want to talk about that's a historical action film that's a huge failure is Legend of Hercules. I'm not sure if you saw this one, because this one went straight under the radar for most people.
That's the one that came out at the same. It's a twinner for the Rock Hercules movie.
Absolutely.
But it. Oh, Jesus! Of course you're going to talk about this. It's got your boy in it.
It's got Scott Adkins.
It's got Scott Adkins. Yeah.
You, my boy.
I did see this, and for what it's worth, Valid for your bad, and I'm not poo-pooing the choice, but it's not the worst of the Hercules movies to come out that year.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, that is a battle of Herculean might for terribleness. Don't get me wrong. I do think that Hercules with the Rock is also a terrible film too, but Legend of Hercules is bafflingly bad simply because like it's a movie that really aims much higher than it has the budget or talent for. So in a way it's admirable because it is aiming really big, and on the other end you're like, man, they did not play it smart by trying to do it this way.
I would even do you one step better. Even with the exact same cast, if you had told me it was directed by anyone else, I'd have told you this was an Asylum movie.
Well, okay, hear me out. Number one, my boy Scott Adkins. He plays a villain in it. He's great as a villain. I will forever adore Boyka from the Undisputed series. He's one of the few villains that's ever turned hero in a franchise. A franchise where he doesn't even show up till the second one and becomes the lead character by the third one because everyone loves him so much. But I love Scott Adkins. He's wasted in this movie, particularly because Scott Adkins is an incredible action star. He only gets one real action set piece right at the end. I actually, and here's a controversial opinion, here's a fucking hot take. I like Kellen Lutz. And the reason I'm going to say this is because there was a movie that came out right after the Twilight movies kind of exploded, and obviously he's in those as a side character, like a really small role. He gets this action movie with Mickey Rourke called Java Heat. I think it's called Java Heat. Now that might escape me. This movie comes out. That movie is one of those weird straight to home video action flicks that's actually really fucking good. And I really liked him in that movie. I really liked that movie, and I thought this guy is the next action star. He's the next young action star. And then he proceeds to do a lot of really terrible movies like Extraction, this Hercules film, Legend of Hercules, and he's obviously he's meant to be the big new young lead in the Expendables movies in Expendables 3, which that movie is easily the worst of the franchise. So he has not panned out the way that I had hoped, particularly after Java Heat, but which is why this movie's on the list, because I don't think it's the worst, but it's sorely disappointing for me, which is why I had to put it along with Cutthroat Island as terrible historical action films. I know, I cheated. I
All right,
cheated. I put two films, but at least they were thematically connected.
I'll give you that one.
I see you giving me the lazy eye, you stupid wild west dog.
Reference that will make sense.
Right, it did like three references in one statement. I I apologize to everyone out there who's trying to decipher that. So, all right, that was my choice for the bad: Cutthroat Island, Legend of Hercules. Why don't you hit me up? What's your choice for the weird?
So, I'm about to drop this on you, and I will say off the top that this could just as easily have gone in the bad. So yes, this is a weird one, but it's a bad weird one. This time we are jumping at one of 2004's Exorcist: The Beginnings is the one Renny Harlin.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to choose this one for one of the films, but I have a sneaking suspicion that we'll be covering the Exorcist franchise sooner rather than later. So I was like, man, I don't know if I want to spoil my thoughts on this. So I got to hear what you have to say about Exorcist.
Okay, so first and foremost, we should definitely touch on the Exorcist franchise because I have very, very strong positive opinions about James Earl Jones as a locust priest. And I actually legitimately think Exorcist 3 is an underrated and deeply underseen classic. I strongly feel that.
I wholly
Um,
agree.
Regardless, we are talking about The Exorcist, the beginning, the one with Stellan Skarsgård. So the reason this is on my weird is basically this movie got made twice. And I've kind of alluded to it a few times. The studio wasn't happy with the direction of one, and they had it basically reshot entirely. So one of them is The Exorcist Dominion, and the other one is Exorcist the Beginning. Christ, at this point I don't even remember which one's which. I think Exorcist is the Beginning is the reshot one, I believe.
It is, yes. Renny Harlin's version is the reshot one.
And they basically up the horror, threw in a bunch more jump scares and changed some of the cast around based on who would and wouldn't return for these reshoots. And it is functionally the same but different, and it is so surreal and frankly a fascinating back-to-back watch. But again, I'm only talking about it for the weird because of its weird backstory. Please make no mistake, I know sometimes we get to this category and it's still positive. They just made a quirky movie or something like that. This one is just terrible with a weird behind the scenes story.
In going off of that, like I said, I think we can dig more once we get to the Exorcist franchise, because again, as you said, fascinating franchise to begin with, in a lot of ways, particularly because this is how it's ended at this point. I mean, outside if you don't count the TV show, but I just love the idea that Paul Schrader makes this Exorcist prequel. The studio watches it and goes, and we're talking Paul Schrader here. We're not talking like any other. I mean,
It's
he's an auteur director in his own right, right? They watch it and they're like, oh my God. Yeah, really. Yeah. The studio like watches it and they're like, oh my God, this is so boring, right? And they're like, we're going to reshoot it because this is way too boring. Nobody's going to give a shit. So then they give it to Renny Harlin, which, if you're not going to make a movie boring, Renny Harlin's a fairly decent choice, I guess.
It's worse. Covenant's eminently watchable. Like, stuff is happening all the time. It's just really stupid.
Well, and as we mentioned, Renny Harlin is a hired gun director.
Yeah.
So if you're going to have somebody reshoot something, Renny Harlin seems like he's a pretty good choice, right? And then you watch The Exorcist: The Beginning and you're like, "Oh my God, this is so fucking boring." Like you made a boring movie and then you're like, "We're going to make it less boring." And then you made another boring movie, which is just so baffling to me. I just every time I watch them, I'm like I just don't understand that this is how you fixed it and you didn't fix anything about it. So,
and what is you're like we're just talking about it mostly in terms of, like I say, the kind of behind the scenes drama, but and it is worth kind of talking about the Exorcist franchise, and maybe save some of this talk for that eventually. But just touching on it even a little, like, even within the confines of Exorcist, and bearing in mind this is written by William Blatty, the movie, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't slot into the original Exorcist at all.
yeah, it's just
It's infuriating in its own way. As a matter of fact, it actually cheapens Father Merrin's character in The Exorcist. Actively cheapens his character in The Exorcist because it makes it a vengeance. It makes it a rivalry between him and Pazuzu.
right, which is I think that's of any category, weird is a good place to put this because it is a baffling movie, even without Renny Harlin's addition to it. It's a baffling movie. It's a baffling idea. It's baffling for the studio, and it makes for an interesting story nonetheless. And it's always kind of fun to talk about that. There's literally two Exorcist films that came out of this at the same year, right?
Yeah.
Two essentially fully completed films that are stylistically very different from each other. So it's a fascinating thing to talk about.
It actually is it's a prime example of what different directors can do with the same screenplay, though. So even just as a pure like lesson in what a director's role is, they're fascinating.
Yeah. Oh yeah, fascinating. So I think weird is a good place for it. So I applaud you for throwing this one on the weird, because we got to talk about it a little, and hopefully we'll get to talk about it in the future.
But what about you? What would you say is his weirdest movie?
So I'm not going to say weirdest movie for this one. I alluded to this in the beginning where I was talking about that Renny Harlin has had a really, really interesting rebirth in his career in a different film market. That being that he has been weirdly taken under the wing of the Chinese film market to create movies over in China. Now, this is interesting because, as you noted, he's European, so he doesn't speak Chinese. He goes over to the Chinese film market. His initial leap is for a movie called Skip Trace, which is a Jackie Chan, Johnny Knoxville throwback to the film, similar in style to like Rush Hour or Shanghai Noon, right? Which makes sense that he would be a guy that was picked up there. And maybe this is due to the fact that he is, kind of a good hired gun director. Needless to say, Skip Trace was actually just a way for me to get to the movie that I want to talk about. And that is a movie that came out last year, and it's a movie called Bodies at Rest. Now, I feel bad because outside of Skip Trace, his other two Chinese films he did which was Legend of the Ancient Sword, which is a wuxia film, which is really baffling that you would ever hire Renny Harlin to make a wuxia film. But Bodies at Rest is actually an interesting movie because, and I want to put it at the weird because it is a movie that really fits him as a director, but it's completely Chinese. You could have easily made this movie in Hollywood and it would translate pretty well. And it wouldn't shock me if this is a movie that gets remade in Hollywood. For the listeners out there, if you're looking for this movie to purchase, you do have to import it. I had to import it over from Hong Kong to see it because I thought the trailer looked really good. Nick Chung is like he is a he works in a morgue. He does autopsies, and it's him and his assistant and these three gang members come in to break in because they wanted one of the dead bodies that was in the morgue. They need to check the body to make sure for some information and whatnot, and to grab a bullet or any proof that this person was killed by their gang. And needless to say, it becomes this game of cat and mouse inside of a morgue. Really intimate film, essentially one setting the entire film. It's weirdly entertaining and wildly well done. Visually, it's really strong. One of his most strong films in terms of style. And it's kind of a fascinating film to see this weird merge of Hollywood and Chinese filmmaking sensibilities merging into one film, and how it weirdly works together in a lot of ways. It's a fascinating film to see, and that's why I had to throw it on my weird. And I'm sure you haven't seen it. Like I said, I had to import the damn thing, so it's not like it's conveniently available for anyone to watch on streaming or whatnot. But I do highly suggest that once it gets a U.S. release, that people definitely take a look at Bodies at Rest. It's a kind of a fun little action thriller. So, and I got to throw in the weird because who knew that going over to China, he would be making wuxias and these like little Chinese thrillers. So tip of the hat to him for finding his path after, essentially being booted out of Hollywood. So it's a weirdly good movie. So I highly suggest it. So that's my choice for the weird. We'll move on from that one since I know that I'm probably the only person. There's probably about like 12 of us in the United States who've seen that movie. So, but I do highly suggest it.
Cool.
It's cool. It's great. So I highly suggest if you guys get a chance. It's a little bit pricey to import right now, but I do suggest it. So, all right, why don't we just wrap this up? Hit this last category. Let's hit up your wild. What's your wild card choice?
Me throw a few names at you and see how long it takes you to realize. Jane, Sam Jackson, Michael Rappaport. Yeah, I know it. Michael Rappaport's what did it. Yeah. No, of course I'm talking about Deep Blue Sea. How can I let a Renny Harlin conversation go without mentioning Deep Blue Sea? The movie with one of truly the greatest, just middle of the movie like shocks. You don't expect him to kill Sam Jackson. Certainly not in the middle of a speech. But on top of that, like Thomas Jane, with weird bleach blonde hair, and even the basic premise of, well, we got these sharks and we made them as smart as people without anyone looking at them and going, but why? Why would you do that?
Because we've got Jurassic Park syndrome going on. We were so busy asking if we could, we didn't start asking, should we?
Good. Yeah. No, it's really, really easy to tease this movie because it's literally insane. Like if you look at any piece of this movie, it's literally insane. Down to the science of it, air quotes, or killing your biggest name actor certainly at the time. What, halfway through the movie, maybe?
I'm not even sure it was halfway. It might have been, you know, closer to
Like,
the beginning of the second
yeah,
act.
yeah. It's just crazy, but at the same time, it's fun. And I know that gets used as a word to just kind of blasé, be like, oh, this movie has no problems. No, no, this movie's like actually intentionally fun. It's a silly, big, over the top movie that goes, Jaws did shark thrillers as good as shark thrillers are ever going to be done. Let's just make a silly escape a shark on a jet ski movie.
And it works. It works. I agree. I think Deep Blue Sea is a strange fucking movie, but I think it's a movie that, and as oddly enough, on the day that we're recording this, they announced a Deep Blue Sea 3. So it's a movie that
Jesus.
has, yeah, yeah. The Deep Blue Sea 2 came out a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. So
Oh, shit.
yeah, I weirdly own it on Blu-ray and I've never watched it. I was like, oh, franchise, hell yeah, I'll buy this, and then I just never got around to it.
It's a megalodon.
It's a megalodon. Name's Parker.
Fuck, right.
Um, so yeah, I just referenced the one movie.
Not a bad because I can only remember his character names right now. I can't even think of the actor. Statham. That's not a bad Statham.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. So, no, I actually agree. Deep Blue Sea 2 is a great film. I actually think a great film might be pushing it a little bit, but it's certainly a entertaining film. And for that, it's hard not to love it because it does have a lot of just inherent charm to everything that it does in terms of just being a big dumb shark thriller. So, I agree. I agree with that. So, Deep Blue Sea.
Yeah. And now you get to flip over your wild card.
See, here's the problem is that you kind of spoiled my wild card earlier. And I thought this was truly going to be a wild card, and then you ended up picking it for the good. But my wild card choice is Devil's Pass.
Mm.
So we've already chatted a little bit about it, but the one thing that I tried to not talk about when we talked about it for good was that I think Devil's Pass is a movie that works better on repeat viewings once you realize what the spoiler is for the third act. And just for the audience out there who's seen it, you'll know this, but if you haven't, here is a huge spoiler for this movie. This movie has to do with the Philadelphia experiment in terms of bending space and time and being able to go back in time. And so the reveal in the end of the movie is that there's kind of a time loop or a time flux that's going on in this area, and it's kind of blissfully well done as a film, as a third act. And so revisiting it last week, I was pleasantly surprised that not only does the film hold up, knowing what the ending is going to be, but it's kind of even better on repeat viewings. And so for that, I have to give it a nod of the hat and throw it on for my wild card pick. But obviously, it was your pick for the good. So
To kind of touch on your point a little bit, though, that's not something to be really passed by. Like a decent time travel story that does a decent loop, especially within the darker kind of horror realm, is a very rare treat. And I can only think of a handful of horror movies that even really attempt time travel in any meaningful way, because it tends to be more in the realm of action or drama, sci-fi. The inherent second chance makes horror less scary, so a lot of movies don't bother. Every once in a while you get a triangle or, like you say, Devil's Pass, and that's cool. I think that I completely agree. Yeah.
yeah, I think it works for this movie, and I'm glad you put it for the good, even if it did spoil my wild card pick, you jackass. But I really do think that it's a highly underrated found footage horror film. And maybe, I know we've talked about doing some lists maybe for the podcast, and doing some things. I think doing a found footage horror list, like maybe top 5 picks for found footage horror, might be something that would be really interesting, because I do think it's a genre in general that gets a bad name. And partially that's because it's a cheap genre that a lot of filmmakers use to cover up their lack of talent um, as a style choice, when in fact there are some incredibly made found footage horror films that are out there that really do pull it off with not only style but really thoughtfulness and an artistry that deserves to be mentioned, which I actually think Devil's Pass is part of that. So there we go.
I got quite the list. I'm actually a huge found footage fan. True story.
Did you?
From going all the way back from The Last Signal all the way to the Phoenix tapes.
Oh, Phoenix tapes. Okay. There was also one called Phoenix Forgotten, right?
Yeah,
With the kids or whatever. With
based on the same as the Phoenix Lights. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. There was that one. I saw that one. I didn't love that one either. But so on a side random tangent, in terms of found footage, have you ever seen the movie Atrocious?
No.
It was a found footage horror movie, and it got released by, I don't know, some specific label. Bloody Disgusting or something released it on one of their specific labels. I highly suggest not watching that movie. That movie was lived up to its title. I hated that movie. So I was just curious if you've seen it, because I feel like I'm the only one that's ever seen that movie. And every time I think about found footage, I'm like, oh God. And then there was Atrocious. That movie was so bad. Like, it haunts me in my dreams, which is a testament to just how terrible that movie is.
Although I'm sure, but for every one of those, you get a wreck. So I mean,
All right. Well, anything else about Renny Harlin? Do you want to chat anything we missed, or you want to chat about the director himself that you feel like maybe we need to throw in before we wrap this up?
No, no. Think we pretty much nailed him. Actually, a lot more solid than I remember. It's easy to tease, and there are some real stinkers in there, but you know, people don't get enough credit for being average, but like the best baseball legends in the world don't bat 500.
Yeah. Oh, and I think that's a pretty good comparison, because I think that there's a reason he's had a prolific career. And a lot of people tend to like to remember like his bad films. And don't get me wrong, Die Hard 2 is a movie that I do not like. Eventually we'll do the Die Hard franchise, and I have a lot to say about that movie, but I I don't know if that's Renny Harlin's fault. I do think that he's a director that gives the studio what they ask for, and there's something to be said about that. As you said, I like the term a journeyman director, and I think that's exactly what he is. And it was nice to kind of visit a director that wasn't an auteur for a hot minute, just to kind of look at that these directors do exist, and they make a really good career out of it. So you know so I think that was kind of fun to talk about and revisit Renny Harlin movies for that reason. So I think this was, at first I was like, oh shit, what did I get myself into by suggesting Renny Harlin? And then come to find out it was actually a weirdly enjoyable kind of journey myself through his filmography. But all right, why don't we just wrap this up? So let's go through a little bit of the business for you guys. So please go rate, review, and subscribe to No Franchise Fatigue wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you to our sponsor, Anchor.fm. Without them, none of this would be possible. And I would like to throw it out there that if you have a chance, go listen to our back catalog after you rate us, review us, subscribe to us. We got a lot of stuff out there, a lot of other episodes of Good, Bad, Weird, and Wild. We've got some great episodes on the No Franchise Fatigue. And then, of course, we do have our new series, Fatigued But Not Forgotten, which should be live by the time that this episode comes out. So hopefully you guys get a chance to listen to those too. So we got 3 different ways to listen to No Franchise Fatigue. So definitely check us out. Share us with your friends, and definitely reach out to us. Let us know. We want to hear what you have to say about Renny Harlin and about his filmography. Oh, I would love to hear what you guys choose for Good, Bad, Weird, and Wild. For your choices, definitely hit us up there. You can reach us on the social medias. You can hit us on the Facebooks, facebook.com /no franchise fatigue. You can reach us over at Twitter at the handle nffpod. I said it right this time. God damn, I'm good. NFF Pod. And then you can also reach me if you want to just reach me at any time. I'm on Twitter also under the handle The Movie Matt. That is TheMovieMatt. You can definitely check me out there. Don't forget also, Sean and I both write for Blood Brothers Film Reviews. So if you're tired of listening to us and just want to read what we have to say, where we got stuff going up. At the time of this recording, I just posted a review for Samurai Marathon, and Sean's got a review coming up for Erotica, which I haven't read your review yet, and I'm excited to read it. So I'm excited for when that goes live. So definitely check out bloodbrothersfilmreviews.com.
I love the length of that review. It goes, bleh, bleh.
You just grunt for 5 paragraphs. I fucking love it. I love it so much. And if you ever get a chance, I know I myself write freelance for other places. I just have now a reoccurring writing gig over at 36styles.com, which is a website dedicated to martial arts films. I've got a couple of articles already up there. I've got a pretty lengthy one over on the mystery of chess boxing. If anyone decides that they want to revisit a 70s kung fu classic and then go read my review. I've got some other ones coming up from over there too. Where can listeners reach you, Sean?
You can always reach me at nffpod.sean, SEAN. My name's a 4-letter word, at gmail.com. And again, like you said, you can always read me at Blood Brothers Film Reviews as well. Plus, I occasionally update the Facebook page.
Occasionally, I know I run our Twitter, and I always forget. But our latest episode did go up this last week, so that was kind of exciting to see. So and get to chat with some people about that. So, all right, well, thank you guys for listening so much. You guys have been listening to No Franchise Fatigue presents The Good, Bad, The Weird, The Wild. Thank you so much for listening, guys.